One thing that I've noticed is one of the big downfalls of revival movements is that there's been a tendency where persons, individuals, churches or whatever, that when God would put His hand upon them and begin to bless them greatly and release His power and His might, that they would get an inflated idea. Well, we must be really important for God to be blessing us like this. We must really be something. And the pride would open them up to demonic deception. Let me give you an example. I was talking about Frida Lindsay. She and her husband were closely associated with William Branham in the late 40s. William Branham, some of you heard the name. There's a whole Branhamite movement up in this area, I understand. So maybe some of you relate to this a little bit. Branham had the most dynamic, powerful healing deliverance ministry of the day, had a huge tent, thousands of people coming. Gordon Lindsay was his campaign manager. He'd go into a city and set up the meetings, get the churches cooperating. Gordon Lindsay would teach in a morning service, and he would MC the evening services and introduce Branham. And Branham had come from a very humble background, from a dysfunctional family. His father was an alcoholic, but he had a heart. He was so hungry for God, and he was working as a game warden and pastoring a little Baptist church, working as a game warden because there wasn't enough money from this church. And still he was seeking God. And one day he just felt like he had to get away from everybody, and he went out into a cabin. And there he tells about that this was when this powerful ministry started. An angel appeared to him and said, God has given you a gift of healing, and if you can get people to believe, nothing will be able to stand before you, not even cancer. He was later introduced by Gordon Lindsay, and he and Gordon Lindsay began to work together, and Gordon Lindsay helped promote his ministry, actually, and started a magazine called The Voice of Healing to promote his ministry. And so, tremendous things happening. And great miracles taking place. And Frida Lindsay tells about that one time, she said that when Gordon would introduce him, he'd give him a good introduction, but didn't make a big deal about it. Acknowledged God was using him in a great way, but didn't, puff him up or anything. She said one time when Gordon was away, there was a man by the name of Baxter who emceed the services, and he introduced Branham, and she said that he gave Branham this great flowery introduction with all kinds of accolades and referred to him as a special end-time prophet of God. She said when Gordon Lindsay came back, Branham said to him, Brother Lindsay, I think I would like for Brother Baxter to introduce me from now. He kind of liked those accolades and his ego massaged. And so it wasn't too long after this that Branham began to believe that he had received the mantle of Elijah. He had come in the power and the spirit of Elijah. Based on Malachi chapter 3 or 4, towards the end of the Old Testament, God gave this promise through Malachi, before the great and terrible day of the Lord, I will send you the Elijah the prophet, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children to the fathers, and so on. And so, because of that passage, during Jesus' time, it was taught by the scribes that before the Messiah came, Elijah would come on the scene and usher in the Messiah. So that's why there's a place in the Gospels when the disciples begin to see that Jesus seems to be the Messiah, they ask him, why do the scribes say Elijah has to come first? Elijah hasn't come. If you're the Messiah, why do the scribes say Elijah has to come first? And most of you know that Jesus said He's already come. They didn't recognize Him. That was fulfilled in John the Baptist. Branham came to believe that just like John the Baptist fulfilled that scripture, ushering in the first coming of the Lord, that he had received that same commission and that he had come in the spirit and power of Elijah, and he would usher in the second coming of the Lord. That he had come in the spirit and power of Elijah, just like John the Baptist did, to usher in the second coming of the Lord. So he got this very bizarre self-concept. But even after this, he's still having great miracles taking place. Gordon Lindsay tried to talk to him. I'd say, Brother Branham, you're off track. This is not true. He wouldn't listen to him. Because according to the Lindsay family, he surrounded himself with some people who affirmed these things. Yeah, you're a special end-time prophet. Yeah, you are. You have that mantle of Elijah. Yeah, you are going to usher in the second coming of Christ. And so Gordon Lindsay parted ways with him over this. He continued having great meetings and so on. Branham did. Not too long after this, actually it was several years later, Kenneth Hagin, y'all ever heard of Kenneth Hagin? He passed away a couple of years ago. Kenneth Hagin walked in, it was 1962 I believe it was, walked into Gordon Lindsay's office. And Kenneth Hagin was not very well known at the time. He was just preaching in churches, small churches at that time. But he and Gordon Lindsay happened to be friends, and he walked into Gordon Lindsay's office, and he handed him a prophecy God had given him. Turned around, walked out, and Frida Lindsay was standing there. And Gordon read it out loud, and among other things, it said, "The leader of the present healing and deliverance revival has gotten off track and will be shortly removed off the scene." And Frida said, well, who's he talking about? She said her husband, Gordon, was very somber, and he said, he's talking about Branham. He's gotten off track. He thinks he's Elijah. And so he took the prophecy, locked it in his desk. I think it was around 2-3 years later, Gordon got a call from some of Branham's family. I think it was in a northern state, Indiana, and informed him that Branham had been in a head-on car accident and was in intensive care. Would he come and pray for him? Well, Gordon didn't feel to go. He just felt to commit the whole thing into the hands of God, leave it with God and not go, so he didn't. So I've heard Frida Lindsay tell this story 2 or 3 different times. She said that a couple of weeks later, then they got word that Branham had died from the injuries in this car accident. She said they were told that his head, physically, his head was swollen to twice its normal size from the impact of the accident. And so it was a very sad ending to a person who started out well. And let me say this, sometimes, and I think Branham is an example of this, sometimes our greatest strength can turn out to be our greatest weakness. Or, if we give it to God, our greatest weakness can turn out to be our greatest strength. Because Branham was a very humble person. But he knew that he had come from a very poor background, and he started out as a very humble person. But his humility bordered on naiveness. For example, Gordon Lindsay said that he had set up a huge citywide meeting for Branham, had advertising in the newspapers, had quite a few churches were supporting it, and said when Branham was supposed to show up, no sign of him. He started calling around, trying to find him. Said finally traced him down, said he was at a little small church out in the country, and said, "Brother Branham," said, "you were supposed to have been here a couple of days ago." Branham said, "Oh, I'm not coming, Brother Lindsay." He said, "What do you mean you're not coming?" He said, "Well," he said, "my friend here said he's having some struggles here in his church, and I'm just going to stay here and help him." And Gordon Lindsay said, "Brother Branham, we agreed on this meeting in this city. I've gone there. I've set everything up, advertising in the newspapers, got the pastors all cooperating. If you're not going to be a man of your word, I can't work with you." Branham said, "Well, if that's how you feel about it, Brother Lindsay, I'll go ahead and come." There was a humility, but it bordered on naiveness. Another time, the IRS came after Branham because he hadn't been paying income tax, hadn't filed income tax for years. And so Gordon Lindsay said he went to William Branham and said, "Brother Branham, don't you file income tax?" He said, "No." He said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, a preacher told me one time I didn't have to." A preacher told me one time I didn't have to. Be careful about getting tax advice from a preacher. We're not necessarily experts in that. My point is, his greatest strength, in his humbleness, there was a naiveness there. So that he was open to this fact when this thought was suggested to him: you are Elijah. You're going to usher in the second coming of the Lord. Look how God is using you. Look at the miracles. Look how God's blessing you. Oh, yeah. And he started believing that. And became very entrenched in it. And led to his demise. And so, I'll close with this story. So, the time to especially guard against pride is when God is using us and blessing us. Here's a statement God gave me. The stronghold of deception is pride.